Okay, so today we've got this case, this genetic mystery involving a border collie and epilepsy.
It is a fascinating case study, really highlights some complexities of genetics, and it raises some questions about, potential links between unusual chromosome arrangements and neurological
Yeah,
conditions.
definitely a head scratcher.
Mm.
So this is a spayed female border collie,
Mm.
and she's being treated for epilepsy. And everything seems pretty standard until a routine blood test shows something really unusual.
The veterinarian noticed that some of the dog's neutrophils, a type of white blood cell, contain not just one but two Barr bodies, and that's really unusual.
So what are Barr bodies again? I mean, I know we've talked about them before, but just as a refresher.
A Barr body is essentially an inactivated X chromosome. So we know that female mammals have two X chromosomes, males have one X and one Y. And to prevent females from having basically double the dose of genes from the X chromosome, one of the X's is just randomly inactivated early in development.
Oh, right, right. So I'm remembering now.
And that inactive X is what we see as the Barr body.
Okay, that makes sense. So finding two Barr bodies suggests there's something unusual going on with the dog's X chromosome.
Exactly, yeah. It strongly hinted at an extra X chromosome. So they did a karyotype, which is basically like a visual representation of the chromosome.
Ah, okay. So what did the karyotype show?
Well, it confirmed her suspicions, but it also showed something else. The karyotype showed that this dog was what we call a mosaic. So that means different cells in her body actually had different numbers of X chromosomes.
Wow, that is unusual.
Some cells had a single X chromosome, and that's called X-monosomy. Other cells had three X chromosomes, and that's X-trisomy. And none of the cells had the typical two X chromosomes that we'd expect to see in a female dog.
Wow, that's a real genetic puzzle.
Absolutely. This specific mosaic pattern is denoted as 77,000X, 79,000XXX. And it had never been reported in a dog before this. And it's actually pretty rare, even in humans.
Now, this dog has this very unusual genetic makeup. Does it actually affect her health or life in any noticeable way?
That's the burning question, isn't it? The majority of animals with sex chromosome abnormalities actually show very few, if any, symptoms.
Really? But I would think that, I mean, having extra or missing X chromosomes would cause some problems.
Yeah, and sometimes it does. Often we see issues related to sexual development and reproduction. So, you might see infertility or, difficulty conceiving.
Right, of course.
But in this case, the Border Collie didn't show any signs of those issues.
Yeah.
She was spayed, so her reproductive history is unknown, but there were no outward signs of any problems in that area.
So this extra chromosome, or lack thereof in some cells, didn't seem to have any major physical effects.
Yeah.
What about her epilepsy? Could there be a connection there?
That's where things get really interesting. There's a report of a woman, and she has the same X chromosome mosaicism, who also experienced seizures.
So both the dog and this woman share this really rare genetic anomaly, and they both have epilepsy. I mean, that can't just be a coincidence, can it?
That's the crux of the matter. It raises the possibility that there could be a link between this chromosomal abnormality and neurological conditions like epilepsy.
Okay, but let's back up for a sec. The dog was diagnosed with presumed idiopathic epilepsy. So, they couldn't pinpoint a clear cause for her seizures.
Exactly. And that's what makes this case so compelling. It's like those neutrophils with the double Barr bodies. They were a clue pointing towards a much bigger mystery.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder if this variation at the cellular level could actually play a role in epilepsy.
So let's talk about X chromosome abnormalities a bit more. What are some of the more common ones we see, particularly in humans?
Well, in humans, the most common ones are X-trisomy, so that's 3 X chromosomes, and X-monosomy, also known as Turner syndrome, where there's just one X chromosome. Those are relatively common as far as genetic disorders go.
How common are we talking about here?
So X-trisomy occurs in about 1 in 1,000 live female births, and then X-monosomy, that's about 1 in 2,500. Okay. And, we know that this border collie had this mosaic pattern, this mix of X-trisomy and X-monosomy in different cells. Is mosaicism common in animals with chromosome abnormalities?
Yeah, mosaicism is actually fairly common in dogs with what we call aneuploidies. That basically just means having an abnormal number of chromosomes. But this specific combination, the 77,000X, 79,000XXX mosaicism, that's unusual, even in humans, let alone in canines.
So given that this particular mosaic pattern is so rare, is there any information about the symptoms of these X chromosome abnormalities in other dogs? Like, do they typically cause significant health problems?
Well, interestingly, most dogs with sex chromosome abnormalities, they don't really exhibit a lot of noticeable symptoms. The problems that do occur are often related to sexual development and reproduction.
So things like infertility, like we talked about before.
Exactly. So, for example, female dogs with X-monosomy or X-trisomy, they might have irregular or absent estrous cycles. They might have undeveloped ovaries. They might have difficulty conceiving. But again, this border collie didn't show any outward signs of those issues.
Okay, so this brings us back to the question of epilepsy. We know there was a reported case of a woman with the same mosaicism who also had seizures. Is there anything we can learn from human cases that might give us some insight into this connection?
There is actually some interesting research on Turner syndrome, the X-monosomy condition, in humans that's found some neurological findings. So women with Turner syndrome, they often have specific cognitive challenges, and this is particularly in spatial reasoning and math skills. They may also have trouble with social skills and executive function.
So there's a definite neurological component to X-monosomy in humans.
Yes, and while we don't totally understand the exact mechanisms, it's thought that these cognitive differences could be related to something called haploinsufficiency.
Haploinsufficiency, what's that?
Basically, it just means having only one copy of a gene instead of the usual two. So in the case of Turner syndrome, it's thought that having only one copy of certain genes on the X chromosome could have an impact on brain development and function. And these aren't just any genes, these are special genes that escape X inactivation.
Okay, you mentioned X inactivation earlier when you were explaining Barr bodies. Are you saying there are some genes on the X chromosome that don't get switched off?
Exactly. So even though one X chromosome is inactivated, there's a subset of genes, we call them XCI escape genes, that remain active. And it's thought that this imbalance in the dosage of these XCI escape genes, because of having an extra or missing X chromosome, that could be what's contributing to the abnormalities we see associated with the X chromosome.
So even though most animals with sex chromosome abnormalities might appear normal, there's still this potential for problems because of these escape genes. And maybe that could be connected to this dog's epilepsy.
It's definitely a possibility that needs to be explored further. And while there's not much research on the neurological effects of X-trisomy in humans, some studies suggest that it can also be associated with learning difficulties and developmental delays. So both having too few or too many X chromosomes can potentially affect neurological development.
This is all fascinating. But how does it relate to this dog's epilepsy specifically? Do we know if dogs with X chromosome abnormalities are more likely to have seizures?
That's the burning question, and unfortunately, there just isn't enough research in dogs yet to give you a definitive answer. I think this case really highlights how much we still don't know, and it really emphasizes the need for more investigation.
So we have this intriguing case study, but we really need more data before we can truly understand if there is a link between sex chromosome abnormalities and epilepsy in canines. I mean, it makes you wonder if maybe we're overlooking a potential genetic factor in some epilepsy cases. And that could be true in both dogs and humans.
Yeah, I mean, it is possible that underlying genetic predispositions, things like sex chromosome abnormalities, could be playing a role in some individuals. And this case is kind of a call to action for both vets and researchers to look into this further.
What kind of steps can they take to learn more? What are the next steps in all of this?
Well, I think first and foremost, we need to just raise awareness about this connection. Vets should be aware that this is a possibility in dogs that have epilepsy, especially if the seizures are what we call idiopathic, meaning we can't find an obvious cause. And just paying close attention to even subtle clues like unusual Barr bodies on a blood smear, that's really important.
So even routine tests can hold the keys to these genetic mysteries.
Absolutely. And if a vet does suspect a chromosomal abnormality, they can recommend genetic testing like a karyotype to confirm the diagnosis.
And for researchers, this case is really a strong argument for more research into the role of sex chromosome abnormalities in neurological disorders. We need more studies to look at just how prevalent these abnormalities are in both dogs and humans with epilepsy. And we also need to, dig deeper into exactly how this all works.
I completely agree. It's a really exciting area of research with the potential to really change how we approach epilepsy, how we diagnose it, and how we treat it.
It's like we've discovered this missing puzzle piece, but now we need to figure out where it fits in the bigger picture.
Yeah, and it's a good reminder that even the tiniest details can lead to big discoveries.
And that the quest for knowledge never really ends. Well, we've talked about a lot in this deep dive. Barr bodies, X chromosome mosaicism, and of course the possible link to epilepsy. So what are the big takeaways here for our listeners?
I think this case is a really good reminder that even in routine practice, just being observant and curious can lead to some pretty amazing discoveries. Who would have thought that a simple blood smear could show us something like this rare genetic anomaly?
It really shows how important it is to pay attention, even to the little things, and to always question what you see, especially if it's unexpected.
Yeah, for sure. This wasn't like, a typical epilepsy case, and those double bar bodies, well, they were a critical clue.
It also highlights, this connection between genetics and health, and how even subtle changes in our genes can really impact, our well-being.
Absolutely. We often think about genetics, in terms of inherited diseases. But this case shows us how variations in the number of chromosomes can play a role in health and disease, too.
And it raises so many questions. We need to do more research on the effects of these sex chromosome abnormalities. And not just in dogs, but in humans, too.
Absolutely. I think it opens up a whole new area of research, especially when it comes to neurological disorders like epilepsy. It makes you wonder, are there other genetic factors that we just haven't discovered yet?
I mean, the implications for both veterinary and human medicine are huge. If we can really understand the genetics behind epilepsy, it could lead to better diagnoses, better treatments, and maybe even prevention strategies.
Imagine, being able to do routine genetic screening, and we could identify individuals who might be predisposed to epilepsy, we could intervene early, and maybe even change the course of the disease. It's a pretty exciting thought. And this case, with its unusual finding of those double bar bodies, well, who knows? It could be the start of something big.
It's amazing to think that every case, every patient can teach us something. If we stay curious and observant, I think we can make some pretty amazing discoveries.
And hopefully we can use those discoveries to create a future where conditions like epilepsy are better understood and maybe even preventable.
From Vet NeuroJar, keep those minds inspired, hearts light, and tails wagging.